The newspapers had been rolling off the printing press and into his delivery truck for 20 years, but every morning, Frank Scoop O'Sullivan still read each headline with the eye of an investigative journalist who had once broken stories that changed lives. Frank, 66, sat in the eighth row of the Tonight Show studio, his reporter's instincts automatically noting details about the audience, the production, and the subtle dynamics that most people missed, while his weathered hands moved in unconscious typing motions on his lap. The small Metropolitan News Delivery 20-year service pin on his worn jacket caught the studio lights as he leaned forward attentively. To the hundreds of customers along his delivery route in Brooklyn, Frank was just another reliable newspaper delivery man who somehow always knew which stories were worth reading and could explain complex news events in ways that made perfect sense. What they didn't know was that they were receiving their papers from a man who had once written the kind of investigative journalism that exposed corruption, saved lives, and held powerful people accountable. What Frank didn't know was that his story had been quietly circulating among journalism schools and former colleagues after someone had discovered that F.O. Sullivan, the byline on several groundbreaking investigative pieces from the 1990s, was the same person who now delivered newspapers to their neighborhood. A retired journalism professor had been using Frank's old articles in his classes as examples of exemplary investigative reporting, not knowing the author was driving a delivery truck just miles away. Frank's story had begun in the gritty newsrooms of the 1900s, where young reporters learned their craft by covering police beats, city council meetings, and local corruption scandals. Born in South Boston to Irish immigrant parents who ran a small pub, Frank had shown a natural curiosity about how things worked and why people made the decisions they did. His high school journalism teacher had recognized his talent for asking the right questions and getting people to tell him things they didn't tell anyone else. After graduating from Boston University's journalism program, Frank had landed his first job at the Metro Herald, a mid-sized daily newspaper that covered Brooklyn and Queens. The pay was terrible, the hours were brutal, and the working conditions were often dangerous, but Frank had found his calling in the dusty archives, late-night stakeouts, and confrontational interviews that were the backbone of investigative journalism. Over 15 years, Frank had built a reputation as a reporter who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or discouraged from pursuing stories that mattered. He'd exposed a city councilman's embezzlement scheme that had stolen funds meant for senior centers. He'd uncovered safety violations at a chemical plant that led to federal intervention and prevented a potential disaster. His investigation of a corrupt police precinct had resulted in 17 arrests and a complete restructuring of internal affairs procedures. Frank's masterpiece had been a 6-month investigation into a pharmaceutical company that was knowingly distributing contaminated blood products to hemophilia patients. His reporting had revealed internal documents showing that executives knew about the contamination but continued distribution to avoid financial losses. The series had won the Metro Herald its first Pulitzer Prize nomination and had led to congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and new FDA safety regulations that saved countless lives. But the newspaper industry had been changing rapidly in the late 1990s. Corporate consolidations, budget cuts, and the rise of internet news had devastated local journalism. The Metro Herald had been sold to a media conglomerate that eliminated the investigative reporting department to cut costs. Frank, despite his awards and reputation, had been laid off, along with dozens of other experienced reporters, when the new owners decided that investigative journalism was too expensive and time-consuming for their business model. The newspaper delivery job had started as temporary work while Frank searched for another reporting position, but 20 years later, he discovered that the journalism industry had fundamentally changed. Most newspapers no longer employed full-time investigative reporters, and the few positions available went to younger journalists who would work for a fraction of Frank's previous salary. But Frank had never stopped being a reporter. During his delivery rounds, he'd noticed stories that others missed, patterns of neighborhood change, local issues that affected working families, corruption in small-scale city contracts. He'd written dozens of articles on his own time, submitting them to various publications, but without the platform of a major newspaper, his work had largely gone unnoticed. The Tonight Show tickets had been a surprise gift from customers on his delivery route who had taken up a collection to honor the man who had not only delivered their newspapers faithfully for 20 years, but had also served as the neighborhood's unofficial source for understanding complex news stories and local issues. It was a Wednesday night taping in October, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing a best-selling author about her new political thriller. During his commercial break interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Frank by the way he was observing the studio, with a journalist's trained eye for detail and human behavior. Sir, you look like someone who pays attention to everything that's happening. Are you in the media business? Rican straightened with the practiced posture of someone who had spent decades interviewing people and being interviewed. Newspaper delivery, sir. Been delivering papers in Brooklyn for 20 years. You learn to notice things when you're out on the streets every day. A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. Newspaper delivery was essential work that kept communities informed, and 20 years of reliable service deserved recognition. 20 years of newspaper delivery? You must know every story in Brooklyn by the time you finish your route. Frank's face lit up with the enthusiasm that had never completely faded. Oh, yes, you get to see how news affects real people. A story about budget cuts isn't just a headline when you see how it impacts the families on your route. You understand the human side of the news. You talk about news like someone who really understands journalism, not just delivery. Well, I used to write for newspapers before I delivered them. Long time ago, different career. But once you learn to see stories everywhere, that never really leaves you. Jimmy's curiosity was immediately piqued. The casual mention of writing for newspapers, combined with Frank's sophisticated analysis of news coverage, suggested serious journalism background. You were a newspaper writer. What kind of stories did you cover? Frank paused as if deciding how much of his past to reveal. Investigative journalism mostly, government, corruption, corporate wrongdoing, stories that took months to research and develop. It was the most important work I ever did. The mention of investigative journalism caught the audience's attention. Investigative reporters were among the most respected and feared journalists in the business. Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. Frank, investigative journalism is serious business. Would you mind coming down here and telling us about your reporting career? Frank looked uncertain. Oh, I don't think people want to hear about old newspaper stories. That world doesn't exist anymore. Trust me, people definitely want to hear about investigative reporting. Come on down. As Frank made his way to the stage with the confident stride of someone who had once walked into hostile interviews and dangerous situations, his bearing transformed completely, the authoritative presence of someone who had once held powerful people accountable through the power of factual reporting. When he reached the stage, Jimmy guided him to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, this is Frank O'Sullivan. For 20 years, he's been delivering newspapers in Brooklyn, but before that, he was an investigative journalist who broke major stories. Frank, tell us about your journalism career. Frank settled into the chair, and when he spoke about reporting, his voice took on the authority of someone who had spent decades pursuing truth and holding institutions accountable. I worked for the Metro Herald for 15 years, covering investigative stories that other reporters couldn't or wouldn't touch. Government corruption, corporate malfeasance, public safety issues, stories that required months of research and often put you at odds with very powerful people. The audience was completely quiet, understanding they were hearing about the kind of journalism that most people only saw in movies. What was your biggest story? Frank's expression grew more intense, recalling his most important work. A pharmaceutical company called Biomed Industries was distributing blood products to hemophilia patients that they knew were contaminated with hepatitis and HIV. Internal documents showed executives knew about the contamination but continued distribution because recalling the products would cost them millions. How did you uncover that? A whistleblower contacted me, a lab technician who couldn't live with what the company was doing. I spent 6 months verifying documents, interviewing former employees, tracking down patients who had been affected. The company tried everything to stop publication: legal threats, intimidation, offers to buy advertising if we killed the story. This studio was mesmerized by Frank's methodical description of real investigative journalism. What happened when you published this story? Congressional hearings, FBI investigation, criminal prosecutions. The CEO and 3 vice presidents went to prison. The FDA implemented new safety regulations for blood products. Most importantly, the contaminated products were recalled before they could harm more patients. Jimmy reached behind his chair and pulled out a tablet loaded with journalism archives. Frank, we did some research before tonight's show. He showed Frank archived newspaper articles with his byline. According to journalism databases, F.O. Sullivan's investigation of Biomed Industries was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and won the George Polk Award for investigative reporting. Frank looked stunned. You found those old articles? We did. Listen to this from your former editor. Frank O'Sullivan was the finest investigative reporter I ever worked with. His dedication to factual accuracy and his courage in pursuing powerful targets made him a journalist. His biomed investigation saved hundreds of lives. The studio fell completely silent. The audience was processing that they were meeting someone whose reporting had literally saved lives and sent corrupt executives to prison. Frank, why did you leave journalism? Frank's expression grew more somber. The newspaper industry changed, corporate takeovers, budget cuts, elimination of investigative departments. When the Metro Herald was sold, the new owners fired all the investigative reporters to save money. They said investigative journalism was too expensive for their business model. So you started delivering newspapers as temporary work? That's right. I thought it would be a few months while I found another reporting job. But 20 years later, most newspapers don't employ full-time investigative reporters anymore. The economics of the business changed. Jimmy leaned forward. But you never stopped being a journalist, did you? Frank smiled for the first time since taking the stage. You can't unlearn how to recognize a story. During my delivery rounds, I see things that should be investigated. City contracts that seem suspicious, housing violations that affect working families, patterns of neighborhood change that tell bigger stories about economic inequality. Jimmy continued reading from the tablet. Frank, we found something else. You've been writing freelance articles for the past 20 years, investigating local corruption and public safety issues on your own time. Just small stories, neighborhood issues mostly. Without the platform of a major newspaper, it's hard to get attention for investigative work. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this man has spent 20 years delivering newspapers while continuing to practice investigative journalism that holds local officials accountable and protects working families. He turned back to Frank. The journalism community wants to honor you. Columbia Journalism School wants to establish the Frank O. Sullivan Investigative Reporting Fellowship for students committed to public interest journalism. Frank's eyes filled with tears. A fellowship in my name? They do. And Frank, there's something else. Several major newspapers want to offer you investigative reporting positions. They've realized that experience and institutional knowledge can't be replaced by cheaper, younger reporters. Jimmy had one more surprise. We have someone here who wanted to meet you. From backstage, Bob Woodward, the legendary Washington Post investigative reporter, appeared carrying a folder of documents. Frank, Woodward said, approaching with obvious respect, I've been following your work since the Biomed investigation. Your reporting methodology and attention to detail set the standard for investigative journalism. You never got the recognition you deserved. Frank was openly crying now, overwhelmed by acknowledgement from one of journalism's greatest practitioners. You know my work? Every serious investigative reporter does. Your Biomed series is used in journalism schools as a textbook example of how to conduct a complex investigation. You saved lives through your reporting, Frank. That's what journalism is supposed to do. Jimmy sat back down beside Frank. Frank, you've spent 20 years thinking your journalism career was over, but what you really did was continue serving your community through both information delivery and investigative accountability. As they helped Frank back to his seat, he stopped and looked out at the audience one more time. Thank you, but I want young people to know real journalism isn't about fame or awards. It's about serving the public interest, holding powerful institutions accountable, and giving voice to people who can't protect themselves. That responsibility doesn't end when your job title changes. The episode that aired became one of the most important Tonight Show segments of the year, sparking conversations about the decline of local investigative journalism and the value of experienced reporters. Frank's story inspired several major newspapers to create positions specifically for experienced investigative reporters, recognizing that institutional knowledge and developed sources couldn't be replicated by inexperienced staff. The Frank O'Sullivan Fellowship became a reality, supporting journalism students committed to public interest reporting. Frank accepted an investigative reporting position with a consortium of local newspapers and spent his retirement pursuing the kinds of stories that had always mattered most to him. Discovering that leaving daily journalism hadn't ended his calling, it had prepared him for a return to the work he'd never stopped loving. At 68, Frank still reads every headline with a reporter's eye, still believes that journalism serves democracy by pursuing truth, and still carries his press credentials alongside his delivery route schedule, a reminder that real journalists never retire from the responsibility to investigate, question, and hold power accountable to the people it's supposed to serve. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't written by famous reporters with prestigious platforms, but by dedicated journalists who understand that serving the public interest is more important than serving their own careers, one carefully researched, courageously reported story at a time.